to Love in a Big World. My name is Tamara, and I'm so thankful that you are spending some time with us today. My guest this afternoon is Dr. Jennifer Hutton, and I'm going to let her tell a little bit about herself and the work that she does, but I want to connect some dots for you. Jennifer and I are working on a project that we started during quarantine called Music City Kids. So Music City Kids is an online educational show featuring movement, health, STEAM, and SEL. So please check it out. We launch our fall season next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Central. It's something that you can participate in from wherever you are, either synchronously or asynchronously, and share it with children and families in your area. So Dr. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here.
Having me.
Yeah. Will you please give a little background about who you are and what you do and what brought us to this conversation today?
Sure. So I am a pediatric physical therapist out of Nashville, Tennessee. I've been practicing for the last 12 years and in pediatrics for the last 10. I am a champion of movement in the clinic, and outside of the clinic, I work with kids of all ages, typically 0 to 19, different diagnoses, everything from maybe they can't crawl yet, they can't walk, to kids with cerebral palsy and the adult, or I should say pediatric athletes. And how we got here today, one of the things that I have made it a point to be at the forefront of my movement is being an ally for children with special needs outside of the clinic walls, educating people on the lives that they have to live and the things that they go through and how strong and resilient and amazing they are. And in learning that process of being an ally to those children, I recognized the allies that I had in my life growing up, being a Black female in the South, and I have just made it another life movement to educate others on how to be better allies to marginalized communities.
Well, thank you for that. I'm excited for us to dig into this conversation. And friends, you are part of this conversation. So if you would please go ahead and add your name and where you're from, grades that you teach, what your position is in the chat, that would be great. And later on, we'll have an opportunity for you to share some questions. And as we're talking, feel free to comment, and we'll make sure that we connect you into the conversation. So Jennifer, I was very intrigued by the title of our talk today, Supremacy History, Racial Trauma, and Present Allies. And let's get started with that. So tell us more about supremacy history and why that is so important for us to consider right now.
So I noticed that a lot of the education that was going around prior to the events that have happened were just educating people on how to be culturally competent and how to accept people's differences. But I truly felt like if we didn't go back to history and see how we were introduced to certain ideologies, it would be very difficult to change them moving forward. I truly believe that if you don't know where you came from, it's very hard to know where you want to go and how you want things to be different. And so I did a webinar mainly for movement and rehab people, but it was just chronicling how, Africans were brought to this country to be slaves for free labor, okay? Looking at the history of Native Americans and what has happened to them over the process of time and losing their land and being pushed to the outskirts, and really focusing on how America was built. It formed these thought viruses in other people, okay? It formed these thought viruses as to who was more important, the different ideologies between the different races, that most other or minorities were inferior biologically and intellectually. And to hear that, to see those things on television, to hear those things in your home, and then to go out in public and see signs like whites only, no coloreds allowed, see people hanging from trees, to know that you're going to a school where Black children aren't allowed to come into your school system, or to have laws where you're not allowed to mix races. I mean, there were if you look back at like the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws, it governed every aspect of life. And the thought was keep everybody separate but equal. And it was a fight in order for us to actually come together. There was actual fights that were happening with these protests, with people just saying, we just want to have the same things that white people have. And just because the laws changed, that doesn't mean that those thought viruses went away. We took care of the legal side, but because some of those same people still had the same feelings of, I don't want to be with other races. We should be separate. White people are superior. Those people were still working in healthcare. They were still working in education. They were still working on transportation. They were still working in the justice system. They were still working in all of these different systems. And so they had to be more creative with the laws, the bills, the processes, the curriculums. All of those things were still in place. It's just the laws changed. So I think part of the reason why we're seeing everything we're seeing today and the division that we see and how it's so hard for people to understand that there is racism if it doesn't affect them is because we really aren't educating them on the history and connecting the dots for them so they can understand, oh man, okay, the beliefs that I had, it's not just that I was a racist person or I was a bad person. I got these from somewhere. I got these from my family members. I got these from my friends. I got these ideas from things that I faced growing up. And now there are biases they're unknown, they're unconscious. So the way that I act, the way that I think when I see things, the nonverbal communication that I give when I'm in a space where I'm uncomfortable, it all shines through. And so I really think that looking at supremacy history, it is important, and it's also important for you to understand it's not an attack on you. Just because we're looking at the history and you are part of a group that was the oppressor, it's not an attack on you. So can you take your ego out of it and understand the history, and then see the things that need to change so that we can do better?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's so much to this conversation, Jennifer. We know that half an hour doesn't even scratch the surface, but can you give an example of one of those things that have happened in the past that we're still dealing with today, or has shaped mindsets, behaviors, relationships?
One, I'm trying to think how to narrow.
Because there's dozens, right?
Yes. So there's one that we're dealing with still in education, and I will hone in on that one. And I think that when you go back to the beginning, where slaves were not permitted to learn how to read, it was illegal for them to learn how to write. It was illegal for white teachers to actually teach Black children how to do any of those things back in those days. And then to move to Jim Crow era, where separate but equal, but nothing was equal. The schools that were given to the Black neighborhoods, they had low resources, they weren't given everything that they need. And there were actual times when public school systems would shut down completely to keep from educating Black Americans. And they would give vouchers to white children to go to private schools in the suburbs. One of the places this happens is Prince George County in Virginia. So those are the battles that you're facing. So then you move into things like affirmative action. And one story that I've heard over and over again from many friends is the thought that Black people only get into certain institutions or get certain positions. It's because they're Black. It's because there's a tokenism of filling a quota and checking a box, and not based off merit. And so I think if you look back at all of those ideologies, it makes sense that you would look at a Black person, if you were a white person and didn't grow up around another race, and this is all you saw, for you to think, well, it's likely because they needed to fill this quota and make sure that a Black person was in this space to appear more diverse. So I think that's something that has affected how we look at the diverse populations and institutions as well.
So again, like I said, there's so much to this conversation, but because I know you and I know your work and the value of your work, how has this personally impacted you? I mean, you're a doctor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you are one who has the merit
Mm-hmm.
because you've done the work.
Mm-hmm.
How does this apply to your field and to your area of expertise?
So one story that I've told a couple times during this period, I was at my professional association's large conference that they did in 2018. And I was walking around the exhibit hall looking at different tools and toys for physical therapists. And my two white friends were with me, and one of them has happened to have been an ally in my life for years. And I went to a booth and I was trying to see something that the exhibitor was showing, and they showed it to the group next to me. They let them play with it, and then they were coming to our group next. And when I went to reach for it, which is what we were all doing, she took it out of my hand and then went to the next group. And my friends weren't with me. They were right behind me, and they were kind of like, whoa, what just happened? And so she took it and gave it to the next group and just completely skipped me. And it took me a minute to realize the only different thing of all of us is I'm Black. And so it was like, you have those moments where you're like, is it because I'm Black that this is happening? But my friends immediately were like, that's not cool. She was here to look at that toy, all of these things coming to my aid. But it just hit me. It doesn't matter that I have a doctorate. It doesn't matter that I've studied this hard. It doesn't matter that I work super hard for the children and I care about what I do. To some people, I'm still just a Black woman, and they will treat me because that's all that they see when they look at me. And it was then that I realized this is never going to go away in this space. So the best thing I can do is not be bitter about it, but actually work to educate people that this is not okay. And we all need to learn. I need more allies with me so that people don't feel like that's acceptable behavior. So that's just something that's happened in the professional space. And I also see these things happening in our institutions. The one complaint is, hey, I'm one of 90 in my class. I have heard I was one of 6 out of 71 in my classroom. And I know that you still have to look at percentages and say, well, you still are the minority and there are statistics that may match up. But I would challenge a lot of schools, if you have say over who's coming into your institutions, let's look and see the amount or the diversity of the applications that are coming in and the diversity of the people you're accepting. And were those people actually right, but maybe to you they weren't a cultural fit, or they were different, or they came from a different space, or they spoke differently? Because we have these norms that we place on people instead of recognizing what they could actually bring to the table and having their voice in the room.
Right, right. So talk a little bit more about the trauma of this. What is
Yes.
so we've got this history and you're sharing some of your personal experiences, but what does that do to you on the inside? Because like as your friend hearing it and then being the mom of biracial kids who identify as Black and watching them with all of these struggles, it hurts my heart. What's it like for you?
It hurts. There's nothing, there's no amount of therapy. There's no amount of, camaraderie amongst your own that will change that. Those events sting. And so when you look at racial trauma, which has been a lot of work and research has been done more in the psychology world, trauma is something that affects your nervous system. Your body is built to scan the world of dangers and threats and then adjust accordingly so that they can keep you safe. Trauma, there's an event that's excitatory and you get there and you're on heightened alert and everything shuts down to make sure your stress level hormones go up, everything goes up so we can just find a place to get safe. But then there's always a down regulation of that. So there should be a heightened event and then there should be an event that brings you actually down in that traumatic experience. The problem with racial trauma is you really can never come down, because the minute that you're going down, something else could happen that brings it back up. And it's not just that it's happening to you. It could be happening to your friends. It could be happening on television when you're watching the killings of certain people over and over and over again because they choose to show the pictures and the videos. So you're always reminded that your color, the color of your skin, could put you in a threatening place. And so your body wasn't meant to stay at that high stress level. And so to be there all the time, you get agitated, you have physiological symptoms, which is why you'll hear things like Black people are more prone to diabetes, they're more prone to high blood pressure, they're more prone to certain types of breast cancer. And this is research that has been done to link those events of, if I'm always in a traumatic state or a stress state, then I can never really come down and cope with those things that I'm dealing with. And even therapy, group therapy, talking through, telling your story doesn't change the fact that tomorrow something else may happen. And so that racial trauma is something that has to be addressed, especially when you're talking to children, because imagine a child having to, I remember, I know that I knew I was different at 4 years old when someone said, we don't play with little Black girls. In Mother's Day Out, I can remember what he looks like. I remember the color of his hair. I'm 37 years old. That's 33 years later. I can account everything and how I felt having to tell my mother that story. So imagine knowing I'm different and somebody may not be nice to me at 4, and then having to operate through your school system with that vigilance of, okay, are they gonna like me? Am I going to be accepted? How many of us are in the room? Do I have someone that I can consider a safe place here? Do the teachers think just like the students do? So that, imagine kids in that stressful state all the time, considering I'm different and they can't process everything that an adult can, to have coping mechanisms, to go to therapy, to know, okay, I need to find something that brings me joy. They're still growing, they're still developing. So I truly think that racial trauma is something that we all need to be doing a lot of research on so that we can understand how to help children not become bitter adults.
Right, right. So I find it fascinating, and even as we're talking, some of the things you mentioned or what I was wanting to ask you, you answered the question. But what I find fascinating about this moment in history is that we've had COVID and the recognition of the disproportionate disparity of COVID upon our Black communities.
Yes.
Right? And then all these racial protests and conversations, and after the killing of George Floyd, like it's come together like this. And from what you're saying, like that is part of the history and the trauma at work before our very eyes.
At work, it was like a beautiful like mess that happened to me, because I of course COVID was stressing everybody out. But one thing we had to do during COVID was sit with ourselves and actually be present. And we were able to, while it was stressful, there were layoffs and people losing jobs, you still had to focus on, I'm sitting at home with my thoughts, baking my bread, learning how to do all of these different things. We're out of the rat race. And now that these events like George Floyd and Elijah are happening, you're like, this isn't okay. But you were able to focus on that. You were able to actually pinpoint it because you weren't part of that rat race that made you think, I just got to get to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. Got to get up, got to wake up, got to eat, got to go to work, got to sleep. So coming out of that truly actually helped us, I think, as a community to be able to come together and say, look at all of these systems that are not working right now. We need to do something differently.
So what are some of the ideas that you have about what we can do differently?
So my big thing for everybody is to really sit down and think about what you believe. Think about what you believe and think about what your values are. Because I think starting in the home and starting with ourselves is how we can change. You can look at everything going on and easily get overwhelmed because there's a lot. There is a lot for us to change. But if you recognize I need to be a change agent, then that makes it easier because it directs all the control back to you and says, what I can do is look at what I can control and do that. So to become an ally, the first thing you have to do is be aware that there are issues. You have to say, there are injustices on these different marginalized communities. I'm aware of that. Now, awareness, you will come back to 100 times over because you're always going to learn something new the more aware you are. Then you have to educate yourself. You have to educate yourself, not just on the history of our country, the history of the different populations and minorities in the country, but also what are your beliefs and biases? What did you learn in your household? What did they believe? What did your circle look like growing up? Did everybody look like you, or did you have different voices in your friend circle? What happened when you went to school? Can you recall events that maybe happened where somebody was treated differently than you were and you didn't understand why, but you also couldn't actually stand up for that person because you didn't understand why? Because I think if we start to look at our own blind spots, because what I tell everybody, you're all susceptible to biases. I have biases, you have biases, we all have biases, but since it's the unconscious, it's bringing those unconscious things, beliefs to the forefront, seeing how we have to change it, and then actually mobilizing ourselves and making those changes. Another thing is surround yourself with people that don't look like you, because that's I think part of why we see so much racism is ignorance and the fact that everybody looked like you when you were growing up. So anything that is different is perceived as a threat to your body. So if you could actually take the time and not just get a friend to fill a quota, but place yourself in spaces where maybe you are the minority so that you can actually get a feel of, oh man, this does feel different, and connect with different communities so that you can see different perspectives. And then decide, what do I want to do? Like, how do I want to be an ally? Because you can't do it all. You can't do all the protests, sign all the petitions, speak up against everything, get in the chat. You can't do those things. But you can say, okay, while this might be uncomfortable because it's new, here's what I can do. And here's where I feel like my voice will be effective as an ally.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So we've got some questions coming in, and thank you for sharing. I love talking with you because you're always so succinct about the points, and it's memorable that way. So this is Teresa from Chicago. She's a doctoral candidate, and her question is about racialized trauma and working with students. So in the practice of it, how can we deal with the racialized trauma and equity for transformative SEL work without re-traumatizing students?
So to be honest with you, I feel like we need to bring in specialists who do these things. So there are actual diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants that exist everywhere. There are coaches that can not only help you understand the steps that you need to take, but also the most effective way that you can do it. And when it comes to dealing with racial trauma, I rely heavily on mental therapists, on counselors, on getting their perspectives, because they know trauma. They know what it looks like. They know what grief looks like. They know what all of these models look like. And they have put a practice together that teaches people how to deal with this. So I feel like if we can reach out to those professions, I think that will make us more effective in dealing with these issues.
Okay, good. So the first recommendation would be find a professional to help you.
Yes.
The second, I'm wondering, would it be have the conversations that you need to have without running from them? Like, even if it's, hey, I see that this is happening, or I recognize this with you. Let's get some help for it. Instead of just, oh, I'm just going to pretend it's not there.
I think avoidance has been what we've done. It's been just see everybody as the same color and everybody's the same. And that's not helping us. It turns a blind eye to the actual issues that kids are facing. So one thing that you can do is, maybe you can't immediately have those conversations with the kids, but if you are working in schools, I want to know what all of your teachers believe. There's a book, what's her name? Austin Channing Brown, I'm Still Here. And she talks about her first time recognizing a teacher viewed her as differently, and how she said to herself, well, do all of the teachers feel like this? So one thing you're going to want to see is, who are these kids? Whose rooms are these kids in? What do those teachers believe? And maybe how could implicit bias in themselves be affecting how they're teaching these children.
Yes, yes, that's so good. And that's uncomfortable work to do. I've faced it with my own kids. My youngest son, when he was in third grade, he came home and he'd say at the beginning of the school year, "Hey mom, my teacher, who was white, she likes the girls better than she likes the boys. And mom, she likes the white boys better than the brown or black boys." Pick that up. He
Kids are
was
intuitive.
third grade. That set a trajectory for the rest of the school year. It was one of the worst. So by the end of the school year, it was parent teacher conference. Because imagine how uncomfortable he felt in that classroom, unwelcome, constantly judged. So by the time 4 of us sat down for a principal, teacher, ally for me as the mama and mom, I brought a letter that my boy wrote describing his experience and showed it to the teacher. And she sat there with tears in her eyes because she didn't realize her implicit bias, and here an 8-year-old was able to point it out. So I've done some work with schools, and it's heavy. Like just being able to open them up to having the conversation about biases, because you wouldn't be in education unless you care, right? Yes. And then to look face to face with the ugliness of bias and prejudice and racism, it's
heavy,
heart-wrenching. You know what I mean? Like there's no words for it. And yet at the same time, we have to do the work.
We do.
We have
and then recognizing there's another part that people tend to, it's not as easy to see because it looks good. But when you feel like the minority community or the marginalized communities need your help, that when you even approach it like that and you become the savior, that's also harmful, because to automatically think that a Black child, oh, I'm here to save them because they're in, low income neighborhoods and they don't have the resources. That's not every Black child. That's not every Black child's experience. Okay. So to be an ally, you have to even recognize those things that you thought were good that were actually harmful in how you were addressing them. She asked the book.
Yes, the book.
Asked about the book.
And if Jennifer, you have any other resources you want to share, we can send a follow-up email to everyone as well with links. And then
let's do that, because I have other books. So Teresa, I'll put that in there. Somebody else asked me. Lisette, yes.
Ask that. Any other questions? You can feel free to ask those now. And I think to flip what you said, it's not only recognizing the good that could cause harm, it's recognizing the perceived bad that is actually good. So, yes. I've done a lot of work in the urban areas of Nashville, and I love the neighborhoods. I love going into public housing neighborhoods and working with those families. And some people go, "What are you talking about? It's dangerous there." And I'm going,
nope.
What I see is that they've got each other's back. There's like a sense of community that when you're in a suburban area, I don't know that it exists the same way. If there's a loyalty, there's a we're in this together that is invaluable.
Yes. And I also, when people say things about public housing, I always say, go back and research why public housing even existed. There's a debate that James Baldwin had in London or in England, where he says literally it was trespassing to go outside of the ghetto. It was considered, and police would say, you were trespassing by leaving the confines of public housing, by leaving the confines of these neighborhoods. So really look at how this was formed, why it was formed, and how it's been built. So to see people actually come together in those neighborhoods, it's like that's what they had to do. That's what they had to do, because they were forced to stay in those neighborhoods. And then when they moved out of those neighborhoods, it wasn't as safe. it wasn't safe for a Black family to go buy a house in the suburbs because they faced scrutiny from their neighbors. So there's so much in the history, and that's really what I want people to go back and look at.
That's good. That's good. So here's another question from Jennifer. A white teacher from Trenton, New Jersey, where all students are automatically assumed that we would be biased against them even on the first day of school. So how do we deal with that?
Ooh. Like I said, none of us are immune to bias, and likely what they've faced in their life and what they've probably learned from home and the experiences that their parents or their caregivers have brought them to that place. And so it literally is your job to just be different. And it is important for you to have conversations with those families. And maybe that's the first thing you do is if you feel like this is a trend that's happening over and over again, then you have to be very upfront about what you believe and what your classroom will believe and what you are going to show in your curriculum and how you treat these children so that they can see, okay, this is what she said. Now let's watch her back this up for the rest of the year. But unfortunately, the weight of oppressors has been put on your shoulders. And it's just like when someone looks at me and thinks bad things about Black people, so they think bad things about me. So I have the weight of being oppressed on me, or the effects of being oppressed on me. So it is the same thing, and you literally just have to be different in all spaces.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
I hope that helps, Jennifer. I know there's no easy fix for that one.
No, and it's focusing on building the relationship, and trust takes time.
Yes.
But one of the things that I know, because I have a diverse group of friends, is once they get to know me, once they get to know my heart, then that's a whole nother thing. It just takes time for people to see that. And so I can't, like you said, I appreciated how you put that. I carry the weight of the oppressor. And so it's my job to show them, hey, no, I really care about you because of who you are. I love and accept you. I want to champion you.
Yes.
Can we be friends? And oh, by the way, there's things I can learn from you too. So
yeah,
we just even out the playing field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
But it's uncomfortable.
It is. And I think people are learning that now, especially in the last couple months, because we've been championing, have those difficult conversations, really ask yourself what you believe. And I think that it takes this discomfort of dismantling all of the beliefs that you have and the bias that you have for you to be an effective ally. Because if you've done the work, then you'll be able to understand some of the behaviors in all spaces.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking time to broach this huge subject. And friends, we will share with you some resources. Jennifer will share with me, and I'll send out an email to everyone. Thank you for taking the time to introduce yourself to this conversation about our supremacy history, the current racial trauma, and how we can be present allies, present both in this moment and present as in here for our brothers and sisters who need us. Again, Love in a Big World's here as a resource. Also check out Music City Kids. Jennifer's one of our features for health and wellness and movement. So we hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.